Welcome. We wanted just a few remarks before we get going. We're really excited to have everyone here. This is a great community, and we're excited to bring this community to Princeton. We also appreciate this is a time when it can be harder than usual to travel, where there's a lot of additional challenges to doing science. I think having an event that celebrates bringing people together from different parts of the world to talk about the scientific questions that motivate this group is something that's important at this moment. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a rundown of what we're planning for the next 3 days. So today we're going to have a plenary address in a moment from Jessica Cantlon, and then some talks from our diverse intelligences frameworks that have been set up to organize some of the research activities within this area over the last few years. We'll have a second plenary from Daphne Buxbaum in the afternoon, and then a series of paper presentations, and then posters. And then we have a relatively early ending today, so we end about 4:10 p.m. Our intention is that you can use that time to hopefully explore our beautiful campus. If you go in that direction, that's the nicer part of campus. And take the time to have discussions with the people that you meet during the day. You're on your own to self-organize for dinner today. And then tomorrow we're going to have some more sessions. And then in the afternoon, we have a tour of the Princeton Museum of Art that starts at 4 p.m. So we'll have special instructions for how to do that. So this is, if you want to download the schedule, this is the schedule. So after the tour for the art museum, we're going to have 2 more plenary addresses, which will be in a different room, the convocation room at the Friends Center. It's not very far away, it's just over here. But those are going to be coordinated with our friends in Australia at one of our other diverse intelligences hubs. So we're going to be beaming Melanie Mitchell to Australia, and then we'll have Peter Godfrey-Smith beamed back. And between those two, we're going to have a dinner so people can collect food and then hopefully see the 2 talks. And then Wednesday, we have our final plenary address from Mary Stoddard. And then we're going to have some introductions from some of the folks from funding agencies that are here to talk about the things that they're prioritizing and thinking about within their organizations. And then we have some time for breakouts and discussions. So at the moment, it's a little hard to see, but I've written up 3 proposed breakout topics over there. So supporting early career researchers, communication and outreach. And then the third is just thinking about sources of funding opportunities in these times that can be challenging for science funding. So we have 1 more room available for a breakout. So if there's another topic that you're interested in, come and talk to me. We can see if we can make space for another breakout, and then we'll have a chance to have a conversation about another topic that's related to the things that we talk about in this meeting. And then that's the end of our meeting. We have a final lunch at the end of the session on Wednesday. So any questions before we dive into our content? Okay, all right. So Jessica. All right, so our first plenary address is going to be from Jessica Cantlon, who's a professor of psychology at Carnegie Mellon University. I think this is an exciting opportunity to really have a presentation from someone who speaks to a lot of the kinds of questions that we've explored within the diverse intelligences community. So Jessica's work engages with questions about quantitative reasoning across species, using both cognitive and neural kinds of mechanisms in both humans and non-human primates, and as well as thinking about the context of these within development. And so I'm excited to have her here.
Thank you. All right, thanks. And thanks to Tom for setting up such a great ecosystem. I think it's really impressive, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today. So I study the development and evolution of basic mathematical concepts, and we use this integrative, interdisciplinary approach where we combine evidence from child development, from neuroimaging, from cross-cultural work and animal cognition to try to figure out how humans come to reason about mathematics, and especially about numerical and spatial patterns. And one of the reasons that math is so interesting is that it dominates our earliest cultural artifacts. So it's the first thing that we humans wanted to write down. The oldest written artifacts are things like tally sticks used to keep track of quantity, carved geometric patterns showing lines, angles, repeating spatial structure. The one in the middle here is the Limbobo bone, so it's a tally stick from about 4,000 years ago, found in South Africa, with repeated marks and groupings for keeping track of quantity. The ones on the side are geometric engravings. So I mentioned the one in the middle. The ones on the sides are these geometric engravings from South Africa. So the one on the left is engraved ostrich eggshells from Deep Kloof rock shelter from about 60,000 years ago. The one on the right is the Blombos cave ochre engravings from about 70,000 years ago. Both are showing lines, angles, regular geometric patterns. And what these really old artifacts indicate is that number and geometry were already central ideas for humans tens of thousands of years ago. And it also shows that the most intuitive way for a human to think about quantities at that time was to map quantities onto space, like one mark for each item, so that the spatial structure carries the numerical meaning. And this is a very specific way to think about quantity. And it's one that we've stuck with and that we've kept building on for over 40,000 years. So literally everyone thought about quantity as some kind of spatial analogy like this. So across cultures, humans made things like abacuses and mancala systems and quipus, counting boards. And in evolutionary terms, this was super recent, so just a couple of thousand years ago. These are all analog methods for quantifying things, meaning that the representation is abstract, but it still preserves some of the physical structure of the thing that it represents out in the world. So an analog representation is proportional to the things it's representing, kind of like an analogy. And we think that our modern human reasoning still grows out of the primitive cognitive systems that supported these very early ideas. So we're interested in the origins of these very old and universal human ideas, like what are our original intuitions about number, about spatial structure, and about relations and rules. And what I'll talk about today is how a lot of human reasoning has an evolutionarily primitive analog layer that's especially important early in development. And so I'll talk about analog processes for number, for space, for relations and rules in the brain and cognition. This sort of general framework is building on much older ideas from lots of people, including Roger Shepard, who showed that human cognition naturally preserves metric structure in similarity judgments and in mental rotation. Also on the work of Randy Gallistel, showing that analog codes are present across different species, and many other scholars too. And what we add is the claim that analog thinking is something that fundamentally grounds and scaffolds abstract thought in humans during development. It shares an origin with the cognitive processes of monkeys, and is still our primary language of thought. Okay, so first I'll talk about number. Many of us here know that we have a bunch of mathematical thoughts in common with other species. And one thing that we know is that numerical values are rapidly represented non-verbally by animals and by humans and even by very young infants. So people and animals are good at judging quantities in tasks like this one here, where the monkey's very quickly choosing the numerically smaller of the two sets and then the larger of the sets. And you can see in this graph here that the numerical ratio, which is on the x-axis, has a really powerful influence on accuracy, which is on the y-axis, for monkeys and humans alike. So we see what's called a ratio effect in their accuracy, where their accuracy decreases as the numerical values between the sets that the monkey or the human's comparing increases. And what that effect implies is a particular type of internal representation. This is a visualization of what that internal representation is like for animals and for people. When people are making really quick numerical estimates and not counting one by one. So this is an analog type of representation where the signal that they use to represent quantity is an internal intensity that's proportional to the value out in the world that it's trying to represent, but it's not precise. And consequently, as numbers get larger and closer together, you have a higher chance of screwing up, of making an error. So you're more likely to be correct when numbers are like 2 versus 28 compared to when they're like 28 versus 30. Those errors are predictable by a certain amount, which is called a Weber fraction, which is the proportion difference that you need between numbers to be able to tell them apart reliably. And you can see in the graph here that the Weber fraction for monkeys is 0.38. For humans, it's 0.26. That means that humans need less of a difference between numbers to be able to tell them apart reliably compared to monkeys. So this analog way of thinking about quantity is one that we have in common with other animals. All vertebrates seem to have some form of this analog math system, although they have different degrees of sensitivity. So this figure here is showing data from numerosity performance, like in the video that I just showed, from a bunch of different species that many different labs and researchers have collected over the years. And again, a lower Weber fraction is better. It means you're more sensitive. And you can see in this figure that there's a range of numerical sensitivities across species. So primates, green asterisks, so they're up in the primate cluster. Birds towards the bottom, also that's been like the surprise of the last couple decades, very sensitive to quantity. But the main point here is that all species tested have an ability to use analog numerical representations to make comparisons, suggesting that this kind of thinking is evolutionarily fundamental. And this type of representation isn't just good for comparing the relative quantity of sets, but it's also good across sets. And so, let's see. Yeah, so we've shown that arithmetic thinking is possible in non-human primates. So this is an example of a monkey doing addition and subtraction. So these are video arithmetic problems that are randomly mixed together. So in the case of addition, there's some items floating on the screen, an occluder comes down and some more items join it. In the case of subtraction, there's some items floating on the screen, an occluder comes down and some items leave. And then there's two options that pop up and the monkey has to pick the arithmetic outcome of the problem that she just watched. And monkeys perform really well on these kinds of tasks. You want me to unmute? Yeah. Okay. So they score around 75% on both addition and subtraction problems. And so these basic kinds of mental transformations of numbers, like in arithmetic, can be carried out in this analog system. And this, again, is a kind of mathematical logic that we have in common with other animals. The neural substrates for where these numerical representations are coming from are also similar between humans and non-human primates. So we've studied how neural representations of numerical values compare between human adults, human kids, and non-human primates. And so we've used an fMRI adaptation paradigm where subjects passively watch stimuli, like in this video here, and we use fMRI to measure their bold responses to novel changes in those stimuli. So here the number of items will stay the same over and over again for like 10 trials, and then it'll suddenly change to a new number. And we're looking at brain regions that respond to changes in number, but not to changes in other dimensions like surface area, density, or brightness. And the general finding is that humans and non-human primates show numerical sensitivities in homologous regions of the posterior parietal cortex in a region called the intraparietal sulcus. So in this figure here, the top image is monkey neurophysiology results from Andreas Nieder's lab and his colleagues. The bottom image here is adult human fMRI data from Manuela Piazza and Stan DeHaan and their colleagues. And these are our data here from 3 to 5-year-old children. So these images are showing regions that were sensitive to numerical values, both by showing neural adaptation to repeated numerical values, so neural responses are going down as those numbers stay the same, and they also show an increase in neural responses to novel numerical values. And then the curves on the right here show the numerical sensitivities of those brain regions in monkeys, in 3 to 5-year-olds, and in adults. And so they show a kind of neural version of the ratio effect of Weber's law, where the magnitude of the neural response is proportional to the ratio of the adapted number that stayed the same over and over and the deviant number, the novel number that changed. And so here a narrower curve means the brain's more sensitive to number. And you can see here that in human kids, the neural tuning curve of number is coarse, kind of like the monkey neural response. So kids and monkeys have similarly crude neural sensitivities to numbers. In adult humans, you can see the neural tuning is much sharper and more precise. It's about 2 times as precise as tuning in monkeys and kids. But the important point is that there's parietal tuning to number early in human development in a homologous region to where we see it in non-human primates. And it gets sharper and more precise in humans with age and experience. We tested whether these numerosity regions are also important when human kids are learning to count symbolically between the ages of 3 and 5. So during fMRI scanning, we played kids spoken counting sequences and spoken alphabet sequences as our control. And the prediction is that these parietal regions should represent the counting sequences, but perhaps not the alphabet sequences. The blue regions here show regions that responded to counting. The red shows regions that responded to the alphabetic sequences. The yellow shows regions where they overlap. And you can see that they dissociate. So counting's engaging more of this parietal cortex region, the intraparietal sulcus, compared to the alphabet. We also tested these same children on a numerosity task like the one in the monkey video, where they picked the larger numerosity. And we see overlap between counting and the numerosity tasks in the predicted parietal regions. The outline bits here are regions where those 2 tasks overlap, the numerosity and the counting. And so in these young, not very good counters, the same parietal region that's recruited for the numerosity task in parietal cortex is also responding to spoken count words that children are learning the meanings of. And we found that the degree to which children showed adult-like neural activity in this parietal region, this IPS region, related to how well they could count, which further suggests that this IPS region is important for counting development. Once kids enter formal schooling, when they're like 4 to 8 years old, schools really start to hammer them with this idea that numbers are supposed to be mapped to a line. So when kids learn to count, our plan is that we take them back to the beginning, like 40,000 years ago, with the tally stick, and that's how we start, right? That's not an objectively necessary step in learning to count, but it seems really necessary for us. And we've looked at the neural development of this concept in young kids. And so here, 4 to 8-year-olds are doing a number line task in an fMRI scanner where they have to judge who got it right, Cookie Monster or Abby. So each of those guys drew a line in their color. And there's a control task without the number where they just judge who drew the line. It's a pink or a blue line. It's either Cookie Monster or Abby. And what we see in the blue regions here is that the same IPS region that monkeys are using for these numerosity judgments is recruited when human kids are learning this number line mapping. The red regions here show regions that these same little kids engage during the numerosity judgments, like in the monkey video. And what's interesting is that Maria Malrich and Stan DeHaan and their colleagues have shown that these are the same brain regions that mathematicians use when they're judging the truth of algebraic statements, which is shown in this figure here in blue, compared to a control task in green that's structurally similar, where the subjects are just judging the truth of verbal statements, like rock and roll is a musical style characterized by a slow tempo. So this neural pipeline for expert algebra is built on a system that evolved in monkeys to represent quantitative abstractions of the physical world. And together with our work, these data suggest that this foundation takes root by at least 3 years of age, potentially earlier, and carries children through their mathematics development. So number is kind of one example of an analog representation. Like number, spatial or geometric computations also rely on representations that are analog in the sense that they preserve metric relationships from the real world. And so we've been starting to take a look at some of these kinds of representations to test whether spatial reasoning has a similar kind of evolutionary origin story to number, in the sense of it being primitive, shared with monkeys, rooted in parietal cortex. So we've tested the geometric intuitions of human adults, kids, and monkeys to see if they share intuitions about spatial geometry. And in this study here, we used a matching task to just try to keep the task simple. And we used abstract shapes so that subjects have to be thinking about whole geometry instead of features like color or shape or little details. And the task is just to pick the matching shapes across transformations of size and rotation. And there are a couple of different ways that subjects could be thinking about these shapes. So one is purely perceptual and based on visual similarity. So this kind of representation is captured by the neural network model CoreNet, which works kind of like the primate visual system, going from low-level retinotopic representations in V1 to up to more abstract, high-level whole object representations in area IT, like in area IT. And then on the sort of other end of the spectrum, they could be thinking about it more abstractly, like an abstract geometric structure representing geometric features like symmetry or parallel size or right angles. And that kind of representation is captured by a feature list model. So this is from the work of Matthias Sabelmeier and Stan DeHaan and their colleagues. And they have a feature list model of geometric features that they call the symbolic model. So we use these two models to compare representations between human adults, preschool kids, and monkeys. And when we look at the distribution of subjects' weights for these two models, the perceptual model and the symbolic model, in representational space, we see that there's a lot of overlap between groups, especially between monkeys and preschool children. The main differences are that adult humans exhibit higher symbolic weights than preschool kids and monkeys. and that preschool kids have slightly more robust representations than monkeys along both dimensions, both the perceptual and the symbolic. But the overlap between monkeys and preschool children is substantial, which suggests that abstract spatial reasoning in humans emerges from a shared primate foundation that combines, it's a mixture of high-level perceptual and symbolic representations, and that's continuous across species and development. When we look at what explains variance among the subjects, so each dot here is a subject, when we look at what explains variance by asking which variables lead to categorical separations in this representational space, we see that whether or not the task included rotation of the geometry had a bigger effect on subjects' representations than which species they were from, monkey or human. So rotation causes more symbolic and less perceptual representation. Whether or not a subject attended school also had a bigger effect than species. So humans and non-human primates fundamentally have a lot in common. They overlap a lot in terms of how they think about geometric shapes. And they overlap so much that that stimulus type, that rotation, has more of a categorical effect on subjects' thinking than which species they're from. So rotation seems to be doing something deep. It moves geometry away from simple perception and towards abstract representation. Earlier I showed that parietal cortex carries abstract number representations across adults, children, and monkeys. But parietal cortex isn't just for number. Number is kind of one expression of a broader analog system for representing structured dimensions that are out in the world. And if that's right, then parietal cortex could also be central for reasoning about geometry. And mental rotation tasks, sort of famously designed by Shepard and Metzler many decades ago, are really great because they give us a clean test of geometric representation. So in these tasks, the objects have no colors, they have no labels or distinctive features that subjects could rely on to tell them apart. And so in order to know whether they're the same or different shapes, you have to preserve the shape's geometry, and you have to mentally transform it. And so, long story short, we see similar regions of neural activation during mental rotation to what we see with numerical and mathematical tasks. So this figure here on the left is showing the results from an fMRI training study where we trained subjects on mental rotation, a mental rotation curriculum for 9 weeks. And then we looked at their neural activity before versus after the training. And what we see is that parietal cortex, shown here in red, is overall the strongest system that's engaged during mental rotation at both time points. And also that activity selectively increases after training in these red parietal regions, not in visual regions or premotor regions or in domain general regions. And this is important because this training kind of paradigm gives us a stronger causal test compared to just static brain activation at one time point, and shows that spatial reasoning leaves its imprint, that spatial training leaves its imprint on parietal cortex. We also measured neural activity during the training itself. So the training curriculum was that we used in the study, and I won't explain all the details, but it was designed by this amazing engineering professor called Cheryl Sorby, and she designed this curriculum to help people get better at this kind of spatial visualization. This isn't a kind of reasoning that's typically taught in school, and so people tend to be quite heterogeneous in how good or bad that they are at this kind of reasoning. This is a 10x sped up version of one of the lessons, just to give you a flavor of what the training is like. And we measured neural activity, students' neural activity in this curriculum during this lesson, which is the first lesson in the curriculum. We were able to capture neural activity across a bunch of different regions during the lesson, which is shown in this figure here for different regions. And we also coded the content of the video lesson so that we could test what types of content these different regions are responding to. So what kinds of information are these regions actually tracking during learning? In the video, we coded the rotation complexity, cognitive load, and linguistic density in the lesson. So the rotation complexity is just like the number of degrees and axes that objects are being rotated over at any point in the video. The linguistic density is just the total amount of text and speech in that frame. And then cognitive load is like a composite of rotation complexity, linguistic density, how many images are on the screen, and whether or not a new concept is being introduced. So cognitive load is kind of a measure of general difficulty or information load. We also divided people into two groups based on a pretest, a spatial skills pretest. And so that's the two lines that are shown here. There are low performers and high performers. The y-axis is the mean normalized % signal change in the brain. And what you can see is that these green domain general regions respond to all forms of difficulty, so they ramp up activation really for anything difficult. In contrast, these blue language regions are tracking the language density. And then these red parietal regions are tracking the rotation complexity. So some regions are tracking general difficulty in the lesson, but these parietal regions are specifically tracking the spatial geometry of the lesson. And the implication is that these parietal IPS regions, the same regions that are responding to numerosities in monkeys and children, also drive spatial learning in adults, such that these abstract spatial concepts are being built alongside older quantitative intuitions that go back millions of years. So these analog operations in parietal cortex are still central for the kinds of thinking that modern humans do today. And we think that these systems that, like are shown here, grow out of geometric processes that humans share with monkeys. Okay. Where you really start to see species matter with humans diverging from non-human primates in these systems is in how they apply relations and rules to detect patterns and higher order structures. And so I'll talk about a couple of examples. So this first example, this is a simple matching task. The sample's at the top, the choices are at the bottom, and this is an audience participation moment. This is a humanity test. Which of these two bottom choices do you think is the correct match for the sample? You can just shout it out, left or right. Yes, yeah, so you pass the humanity test. Humans almost always say that one. So that one's the pattern match. It has the same pattern as the sample. It's at a different scale. It has a different total surface area. That seems to be the same to us. But the real answer is that they're both correct. So the other option matches the sample in cumulative surface area. So it's also in some sense correct. Other species tend to think that that's the correct choice. So you can be biased one way or the other. Subjects who like the pattern match are said to have a relational bias. Subjects who like the total area match are said to have a concrete bias. And monkeys don't see patterns. They don't see the left option as quickly as we do. They tend to see things in more concrete terms. They have a concrete bias. So when you give subjects a choice of which kind of match is the better match, monkeys think that the concrete surface area choice is better, whereas the human groups think that the pattern choice is better. So monkeys have a bias to compress the information into like a single scalar value, a single concrete value, rather than computing a pattern across those objects with more parameters. You can sometimes see this kind of concrete bias in little kids too. But in this task, by the time they're 3 or 4 years old, they don't have that bias here anymore. They're still biased. They are biased to compress a pattern and to ditch the concrete information. If you try to make the human groups do what the monkeys are doing by training them and giving them feedback, they struggle, or at least it's pretty hard. So this is a graph where we give subjects feedback that they should be choosing the area match, or they should be choosing the pattern match. So that we did the 2 different ways. And you can see they learn the pattern match fine, but they are limping along with the concrete match, the area match. They don't do it as well, which is something that the monkeys do with ease. Humans are so distracted by the patterns that they have a hard time seeing the concrete information. We have a little bit more detail on what might cause this difference in humans. So this is looking more closely at the Tsimane adults. So Tsimane adults are interesting because they don't all engage in formal education like we do in the US. They do more of an apprentice model. Many folks don't read and write. And so by looking at what Tsimane folks do, it gives us some leverage on the role of culture in this type of reasoning. And when you look closely at their performance on the original task, the free choice task, you can see there's a difference between adults who attended some formal schooling for at least a year versus those who did not. So folks who attended school show a relational bias, whereas folks who didn't attend school show a concrete bias. And what this suggests is that the cultural experience of schooling pushes humans towards spontaneous relational pattern reasoning. We also see that monkeys can be trained to represent the relational patterns in the stimuli, but it's hard for them. So this graph is showing the percentage of trials where individual subjects chose the relational match on the y-axis, and it's showing the 2 different phases of the experiment. The first one is a spontaneous phase where they get rewarded no matter what choice they make. And then the second column is the reinforced phase where they're reinforced for just choosing the relational match. And you can see that monkeys in green go from a concrete bias to relational responding. So the system's flexible, but it's generally harder for them than it is for humans. They're kind of at the bottom of the pack. There are a few different ways that subjects could be thinking about these stimuli. So they could be thinking about the concrete features of the stimuli, and they could compare things like the pixel-wise similarity between the stimuli or the total colored area between the stimuli. There are also a couple of different ways that they could be thinking about the relational patterns in the stimuli. So they could make an analog relational comparison and represent some kind of an abstract contour across the bars. So that would be something like summing the Euclidean steps between bars, or the slopes or the cosines across the bars. Or they could make symbolic relational comparisons and compare the patterns of the bars with some kind of discrete categories or symbols like tall, short, tall. And so we looked at how these different types of representations are related to the behavioral data. And this is a summary of which of those representations different groups are using during the relational task. So this is showing which models explained distance effects in subjects' choices on the matching task. And so each plot here is showing the concrete models at the top, the analog relational models at the bottom left, and the symbolic relational models in the bottom right. And one big difference you can see is that monkeys in green are pulling hard into that analog relational corner and a bit up into concrete. And that's a very different pattern than what you see with the US adults in blue, who are pulling more into that symbolic relational corner. So they're kind of pulling in opposite directions. The other groups are more intermediate between those. And we think this means that there's overlap between humans and monkeys in how they think about relational patterns, but that humans, and particularly older and more formally educated humans, are uniquely pulled towards symbolic versions of those relational representations. Another kind of relational structure that we humans seem to be drawn to is hierarchical patterns. So some researchers like Tecumseh Fitch and others think that we're born dendrophiliacs, meaning that humans seek out hierarchical patterns in information. And what that means is that given the same information at the bottom here, that we humans tend to imagine that its underlying structure is deep and nested, like in the figure at the bottom, rather than flat, like the one on the top. The top structure is a flat ordinal or linear sequence. The bottom one is a nested hierarchical structure. And so we wanted to look at the origins of this kind of bias. And the way that we conducted this study was that we trained subjects on two center-embedded bracket sequences. So we train one sequence of open, open, close, close in this exact order. Then we train a second sequence of open, open, close, close in this exact order. And then what we do is we introduce a small percentage of test trials combining the internal items from each of the training lists. And we see how animals order those, and people order those 4 test items when they're shown together for the first time. And on these test trials with these novel pairings, there's no wrong answer, so all the subjects get told that they're right no matter what they do. And we do that because once the monkey or the kid or the adult learns this rule from training, we still don't know exactly how they're thinking about it. So there are 2 different ways that they could be thinking about it. They could be thinking about it like a hierarchical structure where each open bracket A is connected to a specific closed bracket B in the sequence. Or they could be thinking about it more like a flat or ordinal sequence where like the open A's come before the B's and that's all that matters. There's no link between each particular open and each particular close. And so we test them on these novel combinations of brackets to see how they're thinking about it. And the real tell of whether they're using a hierarchical rule or an ordinal rule is whether or not they make this certain type of error, crossing errors, because those errors shows that they remember the first 2 items of the sequence, but they're not likely drawing the whole center-embedded hierarchy to retrieve the last 2 items. They can flip them and they think that's fine. So that type of error would show that there's a disconnection in how they're thinking about the A's and the B's, the opens and the closes. So if they're doing a lot of crossing errors, they're using this ordinal rule and not a hierarchical rule. This is Horatio. Well, that's Steve Ferrigno, who was my student and who conducted this study. This monkey is Horatio. And so you can see him doing this task. Yeah, here he goes. Okay, so here he goes. Okay, so you can see that there's just a smattering of brackets on the screen. They're scrambled up in space on every trial, and the monkey has to put them in a sequential order. And he's learned to put them in a center-embedded order of open 1, open 2, close 1. And after he knows how to do that, and we know that he understands the task, then we start to introduce a small proportion of test trials to see how he's thinking about it, how he just generalized. Okay, and so we tested monkeys on this task. We also tested U.S. adults and Tsimane adults and 3 to 4-year-old U.S. kids. And so this graph is showing just the test results, just the novel test results. And this is just showing the first day of testing. And so what this shows is that all of the human groups are doing the hierarchical thing. They center embed the sequences. That's what the green bars are showing. And even the Tsimane and the 3 and 4-year-old kids who don't read and write and who don't have exposure to parentheses and things like that, they're all doing this center embedding, whereas the monkeys are making equal center embedded responses and crossing errors. And so that pattern of performance shows that the monkeys are using a flat ordinal rule. They're not random. They're doing great. They're doing great at ordering. They just don't care so much about the hierarchy here, and they're using this more ordinal rule. We then tested monkeys on a longer exposure, so 20 sessions, and they do get a bit better. So again, the system seems flexible. Primates seem capable of learning a hierarchical rule in this context, but it takes more experience for them to get there. So you can make a monkey look a bit human. You can also make a human look like a monkey on this task. And so what we're finding is that there are at least 3 ways to make a human look like a monkey on this hierarchical task. One is to give them a weak memory capacity. So kids who have lower working memory capacities, for example, measured by a separate working memory task, are less likely to use hierarchical rules. And instead, they're, again, not random. They don't just fall apart. They go back to a flat ordinal rule like the one that the monkeys are using. Secondly, for humans, for adult humans, increasing the sequence length, if you go from 4 to 6 or 8 items, it also makes them use a flat sequence and not a hierarchy. So again, they don't fall apart. They do great at ordering. They just revert back to this kind of representation that the monkeys are using. They seem to run out of resources for representing a hierarchy. For adult humans, they start to look like monkeys when you reduce or remove the low-level structure in the sequence. So if instead of using brackets, which have like a containment cue, you give them sort of arbitrary shapes to sequence, even the adult humans struggle to find the hierarchy, even though they could based on the reinforcement structure. They seem to struggle without some kind of ground level meaning or footing. So hierarchical reasoning depends on resources, but importantly, when kids or adults don't have the resources to think hierarchically, they don't fall apart and behave randomly. They're still above chance at sequencing. They just flatten the sequences like monkeys and make more crossing errors. So they revert back to that more primitive representation. And this is a similar pattern to what we're seeing across studies. So when humans don't have the resources to represent complex structure, whether they're responding really rapidly, or they're young, or their memory's taxed, or they lack experience, they don't fail. They instead activate a system of thought that they still share with other primates. So across number, across space, across relations, we see that same pattern of humans using a shared analog system for representing quantity and spatial structure and relational patterns. So we see this signature that's detectable also in non-human primates and rooted in the intraparietal cortex. And the idea is that over development, we build on that foundation by layering more structure onto that ancient foundation. And this analog foundation seems essential for human development. And we think that's why when we teach kids mathematics, we take them all the way back to the beginning, 40,000 years ago, to tally marks, to number lines and abacuses, and we replay the whole history of human symbolic culture together with them, not because it's fun or cute, but because we have to, we must. We have to start from an analog foundation that's shared with other primates in order to build the complex cognition that ultimately makes us human. So just to briefly kind of bring this together, what we're seeing is that analog thinking is the bedrock of human cognition. We have these rich systems for representing quantity and space and relationships that are foundational, that are shared across species, present early in development, rooted in parietal cortex. On top of that, it's possible to build some simple rules and relations, so the kinds of patterns and arithmetics and geometries that both humans and other primates can represent. Overdevelopment with experience, things like school, culture, added memory capacity. Humans layer on symbolic structure, linking representations together, compressing them, packaging them up, which allows the growth of much richer and more abstract rule systems, the kinds that we use in modern mathematics and logic. So over development, humans uniquely build on their cognition by layering more symbolic structure onto this ancient primate foundation that's already there. Okay, so I'll end there. Thank you so much for coming today. Thanks to Tom for the invitation, and I want to thank and acknowledge all of the people in our lab at Carnegie Mellon who conducted many of these studies. Thank you.
Great, we have time for questions.
Yeah.
So, thanks. Sorry. Thank you. I was intrigued by the result you showed with hierarchical structure and how human adults are, if you show them something that looks like a parentheses, they're very good at this hierarchical structure, but if you give them just arbitrary symbols, it falls apart. So we have obviously learned about this kind of containment structures. There's something that would be ecologically relevant for monkeys.
Yeah.
That would, like, manipulating objects in real life as opposed to on a screen, that would make them more hierarchical?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think probably yes. I think containment is sort of visually present, and I think it helps. I think it's the reason they're able to kind of pull it off after 20 sessions. So I think they can do it. Yes, and so with little kids, with 3-year-olds, one of the paradigms we've used is to present just images of adult and baby animals. So it's like mommy, baby, but it's like deer and lions. And that helps. So yes, changing the grounding helps. We haven't yet done that with monkeys, but my looking at 3-year-olds, I suspect that something like that would work, yeah, and that would facilitate hierarchical representations. I don't know how much, because I think another core limitation with monkeys is not just the semantics, it's also the memory capacity to be able to think about 4 things at the same time and their relationships, and to manage that over new instances. So I think there's a bottleneck, a capacity bottleneck, that also gets in the way of primates' hierarchical reasoning. But I do think that, they have the kind of ability to think in that way, given that constraint, and so ecologically valid stimuli could help. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and I have a question about the boundaries between the analog representation that you're proposing and more concrete examples. For example, I was thinking of how human children often learn arithmetic, being the first example in the first section. For example, I remember cases when, for example, when I was a kid, and I can't do arithmetic like 3 + 5. My parents would be like, okay, think about you have three apples, and now you have 5 more. What are you going to have? Or something like, for example, okay, have 3 fingers, and then put out 5 more, and then count from the beginning. So it seems like that it's kind of very hard for very young children to think in terms of abstract units. Okay, so there are 8 units of certain things out here, and you can do arithmetic over those things. But rather they have to rely on concrete examples. So I was wondering how to consider that in relation to the analog hypothesis being driven here. Is it more consistent with one or the other? And how does it change across development?
Yeah, so I think what you're describing is an analog representation. So a more concrete representation would be sort of literal similarity matchings, a much more perceptual or imagistic kind of relation or correspondence. So I think when you're talking about abstractions, that you mentally abstract away from fingers or apples or whatever into a quantitative representation, that is an analog representation. And little kids can do quite well with that. It all takes a little bit of learning and finessing, because modern human cultural math is so far away from that, right? That translation can be a little bit tricky. So I think there is some difficulty there. But the mode of reasoning that you're talking about, that we bring kids into to get off the ground in mathematics, is an analog one. Yeah.
Thanks, lovely talk. A very consistent set of findings. But I wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit, just for fun. In the task that you're showing, there's kind of a digital, discrete, symbolic alternative, and then another alternative that you're presenting, which is usually spatial, right, on these two-dimensional touchscreen tasks. And so I'm wondering if it needs to be this kind of analog, spatial, metric preserving format that is the foundation, or it could be something broader. So Josette Call and I's work on objects, we've also got a sort of similar line of thinking that there's the symbolic discrete that you need schooling for, and then there's something else which maybe is more analog, but it's difficult to pin down exactly what the format of that representation might be. And if you were away from a touchscreen, then you have other alternatives available to you, such as embodied. I think your example was quite embodied, or something more dynamic as well, something that's in relation to action. So sort of thinking about some of the classic counting work on horses, looking at sequentially presented information and holding that through time. So could there be kind of a broader set of foundations, with this being one of them? Would that be consistent with what you're thinking, or do you think everything needs to come down to this kind of spatial embedding of information?
So what's the alternative? So what's the alternative that you're describing to an analog representation?
I guess it's something like a functional causal logic. So maybe related to Melanie's question, if you think about that idea of containment, that if you had an object that was in two halves or something like that, so the humans finding it easier to learn the parentheses, and the monkeys, maybe for monkeys, the parentheses are just the stars and the squares, and they don't see that relation. But if it was about two things that can crush a nut and two things that are pokey sticks, that have a functional relevance that you can chunk and categorize, there wouldn't be anything particularly metric or spatial about that, but it would still be relational. I think there are other kinds of relations, beyond quantitative ones. I think, the kinds of relations that I'm talking about here are sort of in the quantitative domain. But, there's sameness even for shape or color or things like that, right, that you can use to sort of bootstrap nested relations. So, you can use other dimensions. They're not very good at that, right, monkeys? They're not very good at using sameness in terms of arbitrary colors, but they might do better on same relations if it's functional.
If there are meaningful relations, right, that they've represented from the physical world, that they could certainly use those as grounding, in order to try to identify deeper nested hierarchies and relationships in action sequences and things like that, for sure. So, and I think the motor domain is really interesting because, in some ways, in terms of thinking about inner programs that an individual might represent, I think the motor domain is probably sort of ground zero for a lot of that programmatic thinking, like if-thens and loops and nestings and things like that. So I think action is a great sort of workspace for thinking about relational representations. And then, and I think with action and motor representation, there's a question about how much do they generalize, right, to other kinds of thinking. So is there a throughway from the kinds of programs, inner programs, or hierarchical representations you might make in the motor domain to spatial or perceptual or quantitative reasoning? I think that's an interesting question too. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much for the presentation. Really interesting, all the different areas that you touched on. One of the things that I wanted to ask about, and I had a bunch of different questions, but I think the one towards the end when you were talking about hierarchical reasoning, and sorry, I'm following on from the others, in that I'm also asking about that particular question, that area, in that the rhesus monkeys you're testing live normally in very complex societies. There's a lot of hierarchy in them. they're constantly changing, they're despotic animals, they're constantly fighting to get to the top, they know the hierarchies, and the hierarchies are very complex. So depending on how your animals are housed, what experiences they have, and also if you test them on, say, faces of individuals who they know, in what the hierarchy is at that present time, if it's a large enough group, I'm predicting that you would find that they would have hierarchical reasoning right there without any problem. If you did that with humans, I think you'd find it much more difficult. So I think it'd be reversed in the species, because they would have more difficulty kind of remembering the hierarchy, because we don't pay as much attention, although we do pay attention to that, but we don't pay as much attention to that. So that would be a really interesting study to follow on, to see if you have a more ecological valid question in terms of the social hierarchy. Because that's what they're going to pay attention to. The abstract objects in their environment don't really have hierarchy to them. We may have that. We may, value our cell phones more than we value, a paper cup. But we don't have that kind of, the animals, the monkeys won't have that. So I think that might be a way forward to kind of look at that in a social context. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are still a lot of open questions. We call it a hierarchy, and we see that behaviorally they're sensitive to that. But I think there are still a lot of open questions about exactly how they're representing the hierarchy. So, there are sort of iterative, non-tree-like representations that monkeys could be using socially, like iterative ones that are like lists of lists, or something like that. I think there's still a lot of open questions about how exactly in the wild are monkeys representing hierarchies. Like behaviorally, the output is hierarchical, right? But that doesn't tell us what the inner representation is like. So I think there are a lot of interesting questions there. I think part of the purpose of using novel tasks that they've never done before is to be able to dissociate, right, what their experience is from what their problem-solving ability is in a new situation. And so, once you kind of frame these tasks as foraging problems, where they're problems you have to solve in order to get food, right, you're kind of embedding a validity in it, right, that this is a foraging problem. It's a weird one. It's like, if you went to the store and they said, oh, okay, the way you get food here is you need to move all these groceries from this side over to this side, and then you'll get food, right? It's not exactly ecologically valid for us, but we can solve it. We can figure out how to do it because it's relevant for us to do it to get food. And so, these are questions about what kinds of problem-solving skills do animals have for solving new kinds of problems. And then, I think there are questions about how much of the ecology, the cognitive machinery for the ecology do you think is innate or not, right? Like, is there some inner benefit that they automatically get from reasoning hierarchically about other animals, or is that something they've picked up over the years of living with other animals? I think those are sort of interesting questions to try to disentangle too. But I think separating the problem solving and creating new problems that the animals have to solve in the context of a foraging, puzzle is an interesting way to sort of look at problem solving sort of separately from that too.
Thanks, great talk. To what extent do you think the mathematical reasoning you're describing here is also being used, the same neural machinery is being used when thinking about like kind of doing mathematical operations internally? So if I'm thinking about two plans and thinking about the pros and cons, I'm adding and subtracting, or like Fran's question about power hierarchies and things like that. Are these same representations being used when I'm thinking about those kind of internal processes, or like thinking about probabilistic reasoning, or is this really for kind of reasoning about mathematics in the external world?
So, I think there's been some interesting work on, I don't know the answer, but I think there are some interesting examples of primates tracking probabilities. And when they do that, you see a lot of the same sort of Weber's law signatures of their reasoning. And you see sort of similar levels of sensitivity, although there's often a penalty because there's sort of double noise in a probabilistic representation compared to just a pure numerical one. So I think they can be related. I don't know how abstractly our probabilistic reasoning, like, I have, I can't even think of a really good example, but if you're reasoning about the odds that you're going to win a fight between your group and another group versus like the odds that it's going to rain and I should bring an umbrella, like, is that one process or is that multiple? And I think that's a really cool question, and I don't know the answer to that, but I think in the quantitative domain, probabilistic reasoning about the number of red to blue dots or the number of apples to oranges or whatever, that probabilistic reasoning looks very similar. It has similar signatures. It kicks off to what we see in numerical reasoning.